Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to this panel, which I hope will provide a good deal of variety, as well as our linking theme. I'm starting off in the early 20th century, and we will move forward chronologically through the 20th century as we speak. So, following the theme of the conference, I'd like to begin our panel's look at how time in the periodical challenges centres and peripheries, inspired by the work of Margaret Beetham in Open and Closed, the periodical as a publishing genre, which is a very influential essay from the 1990s, which I'm sure you remember. Here she is in image, if not in person, although she's told me that she's here with us in spirit, which is very encouraging. You'll recall that in this article she explores how the periodical is both in and out of time, to quote, at once so evanescent and enduring, and yet the most time-oriented of print forms. I'm going to begin by looking at one way in which central or conventional expectations of time were challenged by the device of reprinting, republication, or reusing, and look at one example to show how it can work, possibly to promote a sense of continuity. Now, reprinting can have varied connotations in differing fields. For example, in academic publishing, if you submit a paper to an online journal or a chapter to a book and you receive an off-print, a hard copy, it's often known as a reprint. In comic books or trading cards, it's an established practice to reuse earlier images, sometimes in a new context, for these creative collaborations. However, in books and periodicals, republication of a previously published text is often seen as problematic. And this is what I'm going to use today. Look at the printing of work unchanged that has previously appeared in print. And I'm further limiting the way in which I use the term by focusing on what we might call internal reprinting. In other words, material that's previously appeared in exactly the same form in the same journal, rather than articles copied from other sources, which is a standard practice. When I look more closely at my source material, I realised that what I'd actually recollected as reprinting was often slightly adapting or alluding to earlier printed items. And it was this sense of continuity or familiarity which I found interesting. I carried out an informal survey to find out how readers might interpret items reappearing in this way in a publication of which they were regular readers, and almost all were negative reactions. For example, that it was lazy, the periodical might be short of writers, or more likely funds, and therefore in danger of folding, and most dramatically, that it was cheating. This word is interesting as it implies a contract between reader and publisher, that a periodical will only contain new or at least very substantially revised material. This in turn reflects one of the prime values of media theory, that of novelty or recency. But what I want to argue is it also sees such reuse as a challenge to an understanding common among readers for periodicals, that time flows uninterruptedly forward. So re-employment of material is time flowing the wrong way. Now, in fact, as Margaret establishes, all periodicals can be seen as a negotiation or paradoxical shuttling between the familiar and the new. But this complex and subtle movement is challenged by the eruption of the more definite past that a reader can recognise. However, readers of children's periodicals differ from the adult reader in one significant time-bound way. They are a shifting readership. They only remain in the target readership for a relatively small number of years. Even before the stratification of age-related magazines, which dominated the mid and later 20th century, the maximum period for which titles such as these could expect a reader's loyalty was 12 years. And that's quite an optimistic figure. This in itself creates a paradox which is familiar to those working in schools or universities. The children are always in the same age band, and yet always different children as time progresses. So we can reuse material, and let's face it, many of us do. Editors could therefore safely reprint material once the generation had passed without any fear of dissatisfaction. And there is evidence of this in the later 19th century and early 20th, although not as much as you might expect, I have to say. So, enough of such generalisations. We need to narrow the field to a specific area and indeed publication. Here we go. Some of you may know I've been working on children's temperance periodicals for the past few years, particularly for my forthcoming book, which is out in November. This is the small obligatory plug. And reading issues produced during the progress of the First World War made me reconsider the uses of this reuse, and indeed to see how it might serve a positive purpose. There were several such titles in the period, but I've chosen the market leader, the Band of Hope Review, which incidentally had a female editor in the first years of the 20th century. The Band of Hope, founded in Leeds in 1847, swiftly became the largest children's temperance organisation. Time forbids me to say why there was a children's temperance publication, but all I'll say is Google me and you'll see I've written a lot about it. And indeed, it was the largest children's group that's ever existed. With young members signing the total abstinence pledge from alcohol and meeting at least once weekly in groups varying from single figures in rural districts up to 300 in inner city areas. Meetings involved cultural and practical activities spilling over into concerts, festivals and other unifying events which provided occupation and entertainment for the children as well, of course, as temperance propaganda. In common with all temperance groups, it saw one of its prime functions as spreading the word. And a subscription to a temperance monthly magazine became increasingly included in the very small membership fee during the second half of the 19th century. It was customary for those children who could to pay a halfpenny a week for membership, and this included refreshment, summer outings, and a magazine each month, most commonly the Band of Hope Review. The review was very successful, partly because after the first few years the National Band of Hope Union undertook the publication, hence the tie-up with subscription as part of membership, and it was even subsidised to some extent in lean times by the parent organisation. As with any successful title, it changed format, style, size and address to its audience. Here are 50 years apart mastheads. On the generational principle I've already outlined, reprints of articles, poems or illustrations tend to be about 11 or 12 years apart. In the review, as this 1911 extract from my very old-style database illustrates, which is just basically a list of notes, this is the entry for November 1911, and you'll see that on the third line, this is a reprint with the same title from 1900, and this occurs relatively frequently. But during the First World War, I would argue, reprints were used with an additional purpose in mind, that of reassurance or giving a sense of stability in a very uncertain period. The changed masthead illustrated the engagement with the First World War, which the review had in common with most other children's magazines of this period. Reference to the war only actually appears from January 1915, but the last few issues of 1914 may well have been planned, not to say printed, before the announcement that Britain was at war, on August the 4th, 1914. By 1915, the war was already affecting children's daily lives. The government had brought in regulations ensuring darkened streets in late 1914 to prepare for enemy air raids, which did begin in December of that year. And this was to be a key factor in the crumbling of some regular Band of Hope meetings during the next few years. Parents kept children at home, and workers were also perhaps reluctant to make journeys in these conditions. And of course, many people were taken away from voluntary activity by war work, so there were fewer adults to run the meetings. Children were not only deprived of opportunities, therefore, for education, entertainment, and the development of a variety of skills, which they got in meeting, but also lived with daily news of death in a climate of fear and uncertainty. January 1915's issue of the review shows that the war is going to become a dominant topic in the magazine. It opens, the whole magazine issue, with a page-and-a-half article on Belgian refugees, including evocative descriptions and photographs of wrecked houses and violent deeds by soldiers. Continuing, let me picture it for you, the article presents scenes which might be considered upsetting for children. As it says, sometimes quite little boys and girls have been maimed and murdered by brutal soldiers. Sons and daughters have seen fathers and grandfathers led away to be shot and their mothers brutally treated. Hundreds of innocent people have been driven away and their dearly beloved homes burnt to the ground. The review faced a difficult task, as it needed to negotiate its position, including references to the current fighting to satisfy the young reader's curiosity and wish to be well informed, but also, even here at the beginning of the war, supplying its young audience with comfort and therefore the familiar. This shuttling between the new and the familiar, characteristic in periodicals in any case, was dramatised, I would argue, in war conditions, when the new was often unpleasantly so, and reused material would be all the more welcome. In such a situation, we cannot cast past or present as central or peripheral. Both combine to balance the reader's individual experience. So, although serial fiction, spanning time, was relatively rare in the review, pre-war, a change of policy at this period provided more continuity for young readers in 1915, with Quits, the story of a schoolboy feud by the editor running for half the year, and then an illustrated serial in poetic form about the Brownies, a group of helpful fantasy creatures, began after this and continued well into 1916. It's interesting to see how individual issues manage the reader's exposure to the war, although, of course, we must remember that periodicals offer a menu which does not have to be consumed in the order of presentation. But often, references to the war occur early in the issue. For example, in Aircraft in January 1916, Wire Entanglements in February, and Fife and Drum in April. All three are by John Rippingale, a regular contributor of factual articles and adventure stories, and appear on the first or second page of the issue. He does not shirk descriptions of barbed wire full of sharp points and tells children that trench warfare is the modern form of war and sudden rushes and surprises are the order of the day as of the night. The first of these three articles opens with, sorry, I've got to do the sound effects. Whir, 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 a zeppelin, bang, bang, crash, followed by cries of terror and pain, then moans for people have been mangled as well as bricks and mortar. Such is the mischief done by flying men in an enemy country. Now, this vivid description might well arouse painful memories in many young people, as well as considerable fear, given that the UK had suffered regular raids from the air since December 1914, with the first of the notorious Zeppelin raids on the 19th of January 1915. By the time this article came out, there had been 23 raids, and casualties stood at 212 people killed and 540 injured, and that was in the early years of the war. During January 1916, for example, there were three major raids on Kent and the Midlands, killing 71 and injuring 120 people, and raids and casualties were to increase during that year. Young readers could hardly be kept in ignorance, and arguably it might reframe their own experiences to see Zeppelin raids related more widely to the rather anodyne history of flying, which Rippingale goes on to do. But after these eruptions of brutally new events, the children could retreat to the repeating world of the Brownies or reprints of items, such as the poems If I Were a Boy in May and If I Were a Girl Again in November, and the recitation Nelson's Signal in December could be seen as comfortably familiar. Joining the Brownies, as I say, regular competitions and other reassuringly stable elements of the magazine's world. Nelson's Signal, indeed, is playing with past and present in two ways, as not only is it a reprint from 1905, but the poem begins, an echo comes back through the ages today like the sound of the sea in a far distant bay. War shortages affected the appearance and the size of the paper during 1917 and 1918 with thinner paper and a reduction in the number of pages, although in July 1918 there was an increase in the page size as a compensation for the greater cost, because for the first time in its history the review doubled to a penny. Content within the pages indicated the privations that readers were undergoing, with an editorial in June 1917 encouraging children to aware of food shortages. It says, "Let us fight our very hardest by daily self-denial in the war which England is waging against oppression and wrong." And the December competition for the best idea is for the best idea for a homemade Christmas present. But continuity and familiarity continued to be present in the pages, with two of their main writers, Reprinting and Frank Adkins, presenting for over 2 years a series of retellings of well-known stories that the children would be familiar with, from Aesop's Fables, the Arabian Nights, Gulliver's Travels, or of course the Bible. These ran through 1917 and 1918. Even when completely new articles appeared, they might be accompanied by reprinted illustrations. This newsboy in August 1918 had been appearing in the Review and other children's temperance magazines in various incarnations for over 40 years. It was a very well-used block by the publisher Partridge. The war surging around the young readers was not forgotten, as Reprinting acknowledges at the opening of an article on the development of aircraft. He says, "Some Band of Hope review readers have both seen and heard a good deal more of aeroplanes than they like. It needs fairly strong nerves to keep cool and calm and quietly do the right thing during an air raid." But the main focus of the magazine appears to have been to combine this news with a comforting environment, with, for example, the institution of a new, that's the aircraft one, with the institution of a new year-long series in 1918. Now, this, interestingly, and another innovation, used photographs of real children, so that the meeting environment was in a way recreated each month with these friendly figures in the Band of Hope Review. Meanwhile, for the meetings which were carrying on, with new voluntary workers being needed all the time, the magazine which supported them, the Band of Hope Chronicle, was reprinting model lessons from a few years ago. Once again, a familiar environment. Reprints continued to appear frequently as the country and the Band of Hope recovered from the war. For example, in 1919, Jem's Joke, a story by the editor, took the identical form as it had when it appeared 7 years before. The pages of periodicals, even more than other writing, customarily shuttle between the familiar and the new. But it is, I would argue, very illuminating to examine this process at particular periods. The new material was not necessarily central. The old material didn't simply act as filler on the periphery. I had initially assumed this as a pattern, thinking they had problems in obtaining copy, it was difficult, but I began to see a different, more complex pattern emerging. Similarly, the young English readers might be seen as on the periphery of the war action, and this was again my initial assumption, but in fact this was not always the case. Refugees and air raids were the earliest ways in which the war appeared, not only in the pages of the review, but in the lives of the young readers. They were positioned at the centre of the war as it impacted on their daily lives. The reassurance and familiarity, which I've explored here, are in a way a reflection of this well-known quotation, originally by Samuel Johnson, but Thackeray made it his own: "The two most engaging powers of an author are to make new things familiar and familiar things new." I would argue that that reassurance and familiarity were a vital and central part of the journal's mission, and neither was peripheral. Thank you.